Joining me now from Liberia's capital, Monrovia, is Ibrahim al-Bakri Nyei. He's a researcher, policy analyst and columnist. In Birmingham, in the United Kingdom, is Amoh Tweh, the former deputy spokesman of Liberia's Unity Party, the one that lost the latest elections. And in London for us, Alex Vines, who heads the Africa programme at Chatham House. Alex is also a former member of the UN panel of experts on Liberia. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. Well, we have to start in Monrovia, Ibrahim, because you're on the scene. The inauguration is complete. How does the country feel right now as a former footballer becomes your country's new leader?
Well, there's huge euphoria, and it all appears as though George Weah's presidency is a national consensus. There were jubilations across various shades of the political divide. People from all over the country were celebrating, and congratulatory messages came from nearly all of the political parties. So it looks like a national consensus.
Amos, do you agree with that? It's a national consensus. The turnout in the second round that Weah won, it was only just over 55%. And he is, after all, a man who has no political experience to speak of.
Well, yeah, I mean, I do certainly agree partly that, you know, the euphoria in Monrovia suggests that there is a consensus, or there was a consensus, and that the excitement, you know, but it's actually based on a couple of factors. From our perspective as the newest opposition, we feel that the victory of George Weah is something that were generally aided by the machineries of the executive mansion in the past immediate government led by Mrs. Ellie Johnson Sirleaf. You will recall that there has been consistent support of 38% for George Weah presidency from 2005, 2011, and up to the first round of the 2017 election. That particular 38%, you know, was consistent. So for him to have, you know, increased that particular percentage point to 61, it took a number of different, you know, steps and work behind the background. So generally, given what the analysis that we did, given all of the different fundings that we have, the executive mansion led by Mrs. Ellie Johnson Sirleaf generally aided the victory of George Weah against the vice president of the Republic of Liberia, Joseph Nyei. I mean, on countless of occasions, there were local government officials who were coerced, who were induced, who were mandated to run campaign for George Weah. If they didn't do so, they would have lost their job. So yes, of course, so generally there is an excitement, but we feel very seriously that there was some level of you know, high play of deception and hypocrisy on the part of the president of the past immediate president of the Republic of Liberia, who generally aided the support or the victory of George Weah.
Okay, Alex, what are the dangers of appointing George Weah as the president of his native Liberia?
Well, I mean, look, a couple of points. The first is that George Weah, it's third time lucky. He tried twice and he didn't succeed. The third time he did, and that's partly because he got beyond that 38% that you've just heard about. It's that he became cleverer, he learnt from his mistakes, he networked, he came into an alliance with the ex-wife of the former lawyer Charles Taylor, Jewel Taylor. She provided a regional block of votes for him, which is why he won clearly in the second round of the elections with some 61%. So lesson number one is that George Weah can learn, that he can improve, which is one of his points. He's a human being, but he learns from his mistakes. He moves forward. His biggest single challenge to start with is the other buzzword that the colleagues in this interview have been saying, which is the word euphoria. He's going to have to manage the expectations of Liberians pretty damn quickly because, as you've said, the economy is in a really poor state. And he was a celebrity as a football player, but as a head of state, he's going to have to manage those expectations because he's not going to be able to score goals all the time. There are going to have to be trade-offs, there's going to be setbacks. It's a very, very difficult task. But at least he's got the goodwill of the Liberian people right at this moment.
Sure, the economy is one thing. He inherits high levels of unemployment, domestic debt, a depreciated currency, growth projections of only 4%. Before the Ebola outbreak, they were near to 8%. There's corruption with impunity. There's a lot of problems. Declining human development indices, of which I'll give you a hard fact in a moment, but I don't want to bombard you with everything. All of you know the state of Liberia. Ibrahim, it's a question of who he surrounds himself with, because all great managers, all great corporate bosses, they believe that delegation is the key. Who do we know is advising George Weah? Who are the people that he has in his ear telling him this is the way to run Liberia and improve the country?
Well, George Weah has 4 sets of people around him. The first set is the group of young revolutionaries that organized the original Congress for Democratic Change, who are very, very much exuberant and zealous for a change. They want a new Liberia. That's one set of advisors. And there is the new alliances that he has built over the last 2 years. One is the alliance from the Charles Taylor's camp, which Professor Alex Vine mentioned, his wife. And the second alliance is the alliance with the former speaker, who was ousted for corruption. Now the third alliance is the alliance with the camp of Madam Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, or immediate kitchen cabinet, lastly aligned with George Weah. We saw that she did not openly campaign for George Weah, but close allies of hers were at the forefront of George Weah's campaign. So we will encourage George Weah to work closely with the young revolutionaries that have fought for the CDC, who bring to the table new ideas, new innovation, new energy, and with the vigor to transform this society. Weah will have to distance himself from people that are already tainted with records of corruption and people who have been tested, tried, and failed over the last 12 years. So he has appointed a finance minister who is very progressive, who has some thought about radical economic transformation. So we expect that this finance minister will help to generate meaningful reforms in the economy in the next 1 year or so. But again, the expectations have to be considerably managed.
Yes, absolutely. So, Amos, this is the point, right? Everything that Weah says is based on hope. The key thing about hope is that it's a forward-thinking emotion. You can only think positively about using the word hope. But hope is not enough. There's a lack of detail in all of his campaign. Is there more detail now that he's president? Has he, in the past few weeks, been putting some flesh on the bones of how he's going to change the country?
Well, the point is that given what we are seeing just from last night, the first set of appointment that George Weah made from last night up to this morning, there is a clear indication that Weah actually agitated his way to the presidency with no detailed policy framework, no specific vision, given the fact that there was some level of discontent amongst the citizens. So Weah took advantage of that and wrote to the presidency with no detailed work plan. So what we're beginning to sense is that Weah is now just about to form a very brand new idea, an agenda that he believes he's going to use to be able to live up to the expectation of the people. But what is very critical, and it's important for us to highlight that here, is the fact that though we are not predating a totally gloom and doom situation, but the history of coalition governments across the African continent is such that it has been one of utter failures. So given the current breed of individuals that are on board at the moment, it makes us to question, or it begs the question of what is the sincerity of George Weah when it comes to the issue of change? Because the truth of the matter is that there are about 6 to almost 7 different officials of the Mrs. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf-led administration who were appointed last night into this administration of George Weah. So it begs the question of the seriousness of change. What is it that those individuals who had the opportunity to work for Mrs. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, that they did not change, that they are going to now change in the new administration led by George Weah? That's one aspect of the point. The other point here is that that Ibrahim regularly so indicated, there is a particular element in that coalition that was basically associated with mayhem and corruption, and a number of those individuals who are in George Weah's immediate kitchen cabinet have got some tainted records. So our skepticism is drawn from the fact that those individuals have not had any positive record of service to the state and the people. So the fact that they are now associated with George Weah and he's likely to appoint all of them into his administration, we believe very seriously that his administration is going to experience massive utter failures in a number of ways. I do agree very seriously that there are some progressive young men who will be appointed by George Weah, who started his movement from as far as 2005.
Okay,
but
Amos,
those individuals,
listen,
like
Amos,
we say in Liberia,
listen, I really want to move away from the politics, the coalitions, the assembly of politicians and advisors that can get together and move on to some actual practical solutions. Alex, okay, I promised you a fact. Out of 188 countries in the Human Development Index, Liberia is number 177. The country imports more than 80% of its food. So these are direct challenges that President George Weah has to address. He says he's going to improve the lives of every single Liberian, but at the same time, he says he's going to open the country to private investment and wants to protect business profits. Sometimes in Liberia's history, those two things, developing the country and helping the people, hasn't gone hand in hand with improving private investment. Companies have come in from abroad, taken everything out of the country and not put anything back. How does he address these critical issues for Liberia?
Well, there are three things that he needs to do, that he needs to focus on. The first one is to focus on building quality infrastructure. So roads, bridges, physical infrastructure is really important. The infrastructure in Liberia, even after over a decade of peace, is still very fragile and it's still very difficult to move around. Investors do want to invest in countries where infrastructure is stronger, more consistent electricity, better running water. The second is the intellectual infrastructure. Education in Liberia is appalling. We have seen the figures of showing how majority of graduates fail, for example, even when they're going through the university. There is a crisis in terms of exams and teaching. So building up the skill base in Liberia and its young population to be more employable, to be in the global economy is really important. And the third thing, I think, is corruption. Corruption is endemic, it's pervasive in Liberia, and building up institutions, checks and balances is going to be really important because Liberia is competing in a global economy. And so to attract investors and certainly more ethical investors who are not going to be predatory in the way that you've spoken about, that's going to be really important. These are possible, these are achievable. But time will be short. Mr. Weah, I think, as president, has about a year as a honeymoon before people will start to lose faith and the hope that you've talked about.
Okay, time is also very short for us. So, Ibrahim, be brief if you can, please. Political appointees receive excessively high wages. There are travel budgets which are ridiculous for government departments, and yet teachers, police officers, other people who perform critical jobs in Liberia barely receive a living wage. Here's another massive challenge. Big question, please, short answer.
Well, George Weah will have to institute frugal or austere fiscal policies to ensure that government has some saving to invest in infrastructural development and socioeconomic advancement. About 80% of the national budget is spent on wages. And the bulk of those wages go to public officials, political appointees, and not the civil servants, not the teachers, not the medical doctors, not the police officers, the frontline civil servants. So George Weah will have to find some way to introduce equality or equity in wages in Liberia, particularly in the public sector. And again, we have to emphasize that President George Weah has to be very vigilant against corruption. He has to avoid the mistakes of the last 12 years. Mm-hmm. The last 12 years, we saw an attempt to domesticate state authority by President Salif and her family. So in order to avoid this, President Weah will have to ensure that his government officials are credible, individuals with integrity, and people with whom he has connection that he cannot easily compromise. So he has to make sure that his family members and close friends are not put in positions of trust to the point that he himself is not able to institute vigilant measures against them and to prosecute them. President Sirleaf failed miserably in prosecuting corrupt officials. We expect George Weah to live up to the expectation of those that supported him. Those that supported him on a campaign to fight corruption. And so he's expected to be vigilant against corruption.
Ibrahim al-Bakri, Nyei, Amoh Tweh, and Dr. Alex Vines, thank you very much indeed for your time, all of you.